Hello, this is Sky Moore. This segment is on restrictions on transfer, and what I want to teach you is simply the different terminology for different restrictions on transfer and which ones are weak and which ones are strong, so you know which ones to look out for or which ones give you the most power. And in this segment, I'm going to use the terminology of the owner who owns something. It could be a script, a film, property, something. They're the owner, and I'm going to call the potential buyer someone on the other side who would like to buy it or restrict transfer. So let's start with the weakest type of restriction, which is a first negotiation. And that is when the owner agrees with the potential buyer that the owner will talk to the potential buyer before owner sells it to anybody. So that's a first negotiation. And the only two things to think about on that is when does it start and how long does it go for? And for example, does it start when the owner gives notice to the potential buyer? And does it last for 30 days? That would be kind of typical. This is a very weak restriction on transfer because if you don't reach agreement with the potential buyer, owner is free to sell it to somebody else. Moving up the scale of strength in restriction on transfer, the next one is right of first refusal. And this is the one that most people confuse when they hear the terminology. They confuse it with first negotiation or last refusal, which are separate issues. What is a right of first refusal? That's when the owner agrees that they will go back to the potential buyer and offer it back to them only if owner is going to proposes to sell the property to a third party for less than the potential buyer offered in the first negotiation. Let's do an example. Let's say owner has a property that potential buyer offered $100. Owner said no, but for some bizarre reason is now going to sell it to a third party for $90. If owner had agreed to a first refusal with potential buyer, owner now has to go back to potential buyer and say, would you like to buy it for $90? If owner is going to sell it for $110, however, then owner does not need to go back to potential buyer because that will not trigger a first refusal. It's being sold for more, and therefore owner is free to sell it. So that's, if you will, a slightly more strength restriction on transfer than first negotiation, but it's not as bad as the next one, which is a right of last refusal. If owner has granted potential buyer a right of last refusal, then every time owner wants to sell the property to anybody, owner has to go back to potential buyer and offer it to potential buyer at that price. A right of last refusal is a very significant restriction on transfer because no third parties will bother talking to the owner if they know that there's a potential buyer out there that can beat them. Because what's the point of spending time and effort negotiating this deal if in fact somebody else can take it out from under them? And so look out for rights of last refusal if you're the owner of something. Don't give that lightly. That's a significant restriction on transfer. The next going up the scale is if you grant somebody an option to buy it at a specified price. You will find that as part of that option, it's always expressed that there will be a restriction on transfer. You cannot transfer it unless it's subject to that option, and that is a very significant restriction on transfer. And the only thing worse than that, going out to the extreme, is an absolute prohibition where some third party or potential buyer can say to owner, you may not transfer it without my approval. That is, you will see that often in, for example, an LLC agreement or a partnership agreement where the manager or general partner says to the non-managing members, you may not sell your interest in the entity without my approval. That's an outright approval right, and that is the most restrictive. So again, going from weak to strong, you go from first negotiation to first refusal to last refusal to option to outright restriction on transfer. Be aware of the different levels of strength of those. And this is Sky Moore tuning out on this segment. Hope you join me for the next one.